Well, good evening, Raleigh Road Baptist Church. For our Wednesday night Bible study, we're going to do part 2 of the Apostle Thomas. And what we're going to study tonight is how far to the east did Thomas go in his missionary ventures. So we're going to start off by talking about a couple of places we know for sure that he went. The first one was the Assyrian church. Now, the Assyrian church is probably where Iran and Iraq are today. If we follow the Apostle Paul's missionary journey, you know, Paul went on several missionary trips. We get the idea that Christianity only went to the west of Jerusalem. But this is not true, for the early Christian movement also went eastward into the countries of Persia, which is Iran and Iraq today, India and China. And it thrived, the Christian movement in those countries thrived for 1,000 years before persecution, primarily from the Muslims, diminished the church greatly. The only church left in that area now that is a Christian church is the Assyrian church of the east is called. Another name for it is the Nestorian church. It's the only remaining Christian church in that area. But it can trace itself all the way back to the Jerusalem church that is mentioned in Acts, the one that James became the pastor of. And the Apostle Thomas is the one who's given the greatest amount of credit due to his missionary work for the formation of this Assyrian church of the east, known as the Nestorian church. So we know that Thomas was involved with that church, which was, of course, east of Israel. Another place we're sure that Thomas was called Edessa. Now, Edessa was a great city in Thomas's day. Today, it's located in the country of Turkey. And it was a prominent intellectual center. A lot of businesses there, a lot of schools there. And they spoke a type of Aramaic there called Syriac. And it's interesting to note that Syriac was the type of Aramaic that biblical scholars think that Jesus himself spoke. Now, Edessa was not far from a city that Paul used as his headquarters, and so did some of the other apostles, the city of Antioch. In fact, it was only 200 miles away, and it was easy to get to because the Romans had built a great road system in that day. So it's quite possible, as a matter of fact, it's pretty sure that Thomas preached the gospel in Edessa and is responsible for establishing the first Christian church there. It's also known that he was aided in his effort of establishing the first Christian church in Edessa, again, which is modern-day Turkey, by 2 of the original 12 apostles. 2 we don't hear a whole lot about in the Gospels, named Thaddeus and Bartholomew. So the Assyrian church, the church of the east called the Nestorian church, and the church of the east in Edessa, which is in modern-day Turkey, are 2 of the churches that are still there today that was established, we are pretty sure, by the Apostle Thomas, and they are both definitely east of Jerusalem. The one place that Thomas is thought by many people to have gone, but it's brought up a lot of controversy about whether he really went there, is the nation of India. Now, we're going to discuss that by dividing India into 2 sections. We're going to talk about whether or not Thomas went to northern India, and then whether or not he went to southern India. The 4th century church historian that we have mentioned before, named Eusebius, wrote this in one of his books. He wrote, "The holy apostles and disciples of our Savior were dispersed throughout the world. Parthia," which was the word for India in that day, it was called Parthia. Parthia, according to tradition, was allotted to Thomas for his field of labor. Well, if Thomas did reach India, and we're not sure that he did, it was probably in this northern area of India, known then as Parthia, that he taught and preached the gospel. There are some, however, that think he not only preached in northern India, but that he preached in southern India down near the Indian Ocean. So let's take a look at that. Some of the old traditions, some of the ancient traditions linked Thomas to having been a missionary in southern India. Now they have a lot of, even today, old priestly families who their ancestors were priests, and it goes back hundreds of years, all the way back to the days of Thomas. And these priestly families in India have well-preserved stone crosses that were made hundreds of years ago that illustrates that Christianity has been in India for a long, long time, at least back to the medieval period, and many historians think before that. There is a tradition in southern India. Again, it's a tradition. It has not been proven by fact. But the tradition says that Thomas arrived at the great port of Musaras, which was in southern India, and that this port was once a stop on the international trading route with the Roman Empire. It was a very busy port. I'm sure it's still a city there today, but it probably goes by another name. It was certainly possible for Thomas to be there. For a first century Jew could very easily, if he had the money, of course, travel from Jerusalem to Alexandria, Egypt, and from there take a ship to the southwestern coast of India, and he could do so in just a matter of a few weeks. So it is certainly possible that Thomas went to southern India, as this tradition, ancient tradition says he did. There are several Christian churches in southern India, and they call themselves the St. Thomas churches. And they are absolutely convinced that Thomas founded their churches almost 2,000 years ago. So it's thought that maybe Thomas went to northern India. Northern India would be the one that's most likely, most theologians think, because it's the easiest to get to and the closest. Well, maybe he went by down to Egypt and got on a ship and went to southern India. So we've looked at the two traditions. Let's examine it a little bit closer. Did Thomas go to India or not? If he did go, what part did he go to? Did he go just to northern India, or just to southern India, or did he go to both? Well, here we can only talk about probabilities. We have no certainty as to prove that Thomas went to either place. For example, the old ancient tradition that Thomas went to southern India is based on very flimsy evidence. It's not written down anywhere. It was passed down from family to family in the churches there by word of mouth. So the evidence of him being in southern India is flimsy. It probably would not stand up in a court of law. There's no proof. There's nothing written down. It was passed down by oral tradition. Even the tradition of him being in northern India is questionable. Now, one of the books that was not written by Thomas, but they used, whoever wrote it used his name, the Acts of Thomas, seemed to indicate that the legends and traditions that Thomas went to northern India also may not be true. So the most we can say is that Thomas's maybe evangelistic journey to India, number one, we can say that it has been widely passed down in tradition that he did go and preach and establish churches in India. We can say, number two, that it was certainly physically possible for him to get there because there were established roads and means for him to get there. Yet, however, from the perspective of a critical historian, one who examines all the evidence, there's no solid evidence whatsoever during the first 150 years when you would think there would be evidence after Thomas died to prove he went to India. There was no evidence until about 300 AD when the tradition started to be talked about. But there's no written evidence anywhere from the time Thomas died to about 275 or 300 AD that even mentions him going to India. So did Thomas go to India? It is a belief of many Christians in India that he did, but there's no actual solid down-to-earth proof. Did he go to Edessa in Turkey? Yes, we have proof of that. Did he go to the Assyrian church, the Nestorian church? Yes, we have proof of that. Did he go to India? Probably not. Probably not. Well, Thomas, like all the apostles, except for John, the apostle John, is going to meet a violent death. The earliest and most reliable accounts that we have says that Thomas was stabbed to death with a spear for preaching the gospel. He was buried his body was taken from where he was killed, and we're not exactly, there are traditions he was killed in India. Perhaps he was on the way to India when he was killed. Perhaps he had even gotten into the country and was killed. But the tradition says he was stabbed to death for preaching the gospel, and his body was moved all the way, or taken all the way back to the city of Edessa in modern-day Turkey, which at that time was the capital of that country, which was known then as Assyria. A beautiful tomb stands there today in that city, in which it is said lies the bones of the Apostle Thomas. It has become celebrated as a Christian holy place. It's a place that a lot of tourists go to see the supposed tomb of the Apostle Thomas. All of this is confirmed, written down by the ancient writers and historians and church fathers of that day. However, something else we know. During the Great Crusades of the Middle Ages, Edessa was conquered by the Crusaders from Western Europe. And we know that these Crusaders then removed Thomas's bones from the tomb that he was in Edessa, and they moved him to the Greek island of Chios, where he stayed for a short time, and then they moved him from there to the Italian city of Ortona in the year 1258 AD during the Holy Crusades. Today, in Ortona is a huge, beautiful church called the Basilica di San Tommaso. Let me say that again because that's a mouthful. The Basilica di San Tommaso in Ortona, Italy. And there is a tomb there that claims to house the bones of the Apostle Thomas. Is Thomas really there? We're not sure. We're pretty sure that he was brought to Edessa and buried in a tomb there. But once he was removed from that tomb during the Crusades, we're not exactly sure where his bones ended up. It's as good a chance there in Italy as anywhere else. So we began this lesson on Thomas by talking about his worst moment. The moment when he did not believe that Jesus had risen from the grave. The moment when he said that he had to see him. He had to put his hands in the wounds that Jesus had to endure when he was nailed to the cross. So although he experienced that moment in his life where he doubted, he didn't remain in unbelief for long. According to the best evidence we have, his encounter in that upper room in Jerusalem with the risen Christ launched him on an evangelistic mission to faraway lands in the east. We're not exactly sure which ones he went to, 100%. But we know he went east and that he did a lot of preaching and missionary work and brought a lot of people to saving salvation in Jesus Christ. It must have taken a lot of faith for Thomas and for all the apostles to leave the security of their homes in Israel and travel to the ends of the world as it was in that day, the modern world, preaching a message that they knew might result in their death. And for Thomas, as it did all the other apostles except for John, it did result in their death. But one thing we can say, I think, about Thomas, maybe we ought to change his name. Instead of calling him Doubting Thomas, maybe we ought to call him Daring Thomas, because he had one moment of doubt and he spent the rest of his life preaching the gospel and serving his risen Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I hope you've enjoyed this time with Thomas. We've done a couple of disciples in a row. My next Wednesday night Bible lesson, I'm going back to my book on some of the lies that Christians have been told down through the years. We'll study a couple more of them over the next couple of weeks. I hope you have a good rest of the week this week. Stay safe. Keep yourself from getting sick. Avoid the coronavirus at all chances that you have to stay away from it. And I hope to see you Sunday morning at 10:30 as we have worship service at Riley Road Baptist Church. Good night and God bless.